Howdy, Aztecs. Welcome to Chapter 18. This is Immune Disorders 2, Chapter 18. So this could get a little confusing, but this is the second video for Chapter 18, but we're looking at hypersensitivities type 2 and type 3 in this video. So we'll look at this guy, type 3, let's start, type 2, which is antibody mediated because it's got IgG and IgM. And you'll see these hypersensitivities will lead to cytotoxic reactions. And then type 3 is also IgG mediated. So if we just take into account at this moment, type 1, type 2, and type 3 are all antibody mediated hypersensitivities. And we'll see when we get to type 4 that is not antibody mediated. Okay, when I teach this in 202, it always takes me like half an hour to explain. But so you've seen this before, so hopefully you kind of understand it. So this is a type 2 hypersensitivity, which is a cytotoxic reaction, which means the cells die. Cyto is cells. So this reaction or hypersensitivity is toxic to cells. So let's take a look at our cartoon. All right, so this kind of grayish brown thing is a blood vessel. And it is the blood vessel of the recipient, aka the patient. That's the person that's going to receive the blood transfusion. So it says here in number 1, transfusion. Now this gets a little tricky. These red blood cells up here are the red blood cells of the recipient / patient. These red blood cells here are the red blood cells of the donor. And then what is happening here is the agglutination and complement binding that goes on between the antibodies and red blood cells of the recipient and the mismatched antibodies or in this cartoon the red blood cells of the donor. So this is a mismatched transfusion. It's a cartoon of a mismatched transfusion because they're trying to show you a type 2 hypersensitivity. Okay, so the recipient or the patient, if you remember from 202, has type A antigens on their red blood cells. That means the recipient, aka patient, is type A blood. And we're not going to talk if they're A positive or negative because that's the RH factor that gives you the positive or negative. We're not going to talk about that in this transfusion reaction. Okay. Now, this is tricky. If you are a type A, if you have type A blood, you have type A antigens on your red blood cells, but you have B antibodies in your blood. That is so tricky, but that's the way Mother Nature did it. So, and they're calling these anti-B antibodies because when they say anti-B antibodies, that means these are antibodies that are going to be looking for B antigens. And when the anti-B antibodies in the patient or recipient's blood finds B antigens, the anti-B antibody will bind the B antigens as usual, and then they'll clump, and then you'll have a transfusion reaction. Okay, so the recipient or patient has A antigens on the red blood cells and B antibodies. So these guys are B antibodies in their blood. Now, the mismatched donor is donating. The mismatched donor has B antigens on their red blood cells, so that makes them B, blood type B. And it doesn't show, but if you have B blood, that means you have B antigens on your red blood cells. That means you have A antibodies in your blood. So A antibody. So I just put here's a picture of an antibody. Here's the letter A. So if you have B blood, that means B antigens on your red blood cells, and you have A antibodies in your blood. But for reasons I'm not going to go into, it's the donor's red blood cells and the recipient's antibodies that cause the problem, that cause the agglutination, and it's because of a volume difference, a titer difference. And if you're interested in that, you can read more about it, or you can ask me in our virtual class meeting. So let's check it out. The recipient's red blood cells go in. The recipient's red blood cells have B antigens on them. I'm sorry, did I say that wrong? The donors, I don't know, this says in recipient. Oh, I see what it's saying. The donor's red blood cells go into the recipient blood vessel. So the donor's red blood cells have B antigens on them. The recipient's antibodies are anti-B antibodies. That means they're looking for B antigen. There's the problem right there. The donor red blood cell comes in with B antigens. The recipient has blood with B antibodies in it, and look what happens. Uh-oh. The anti-B antibodies, which is shown here, binds to the B antigens on the donor's red blood cells, and then you get this clumping or agglutination, and then you have complement binding to this FC portion on the activated antibody, and then complement cascade ensues. We've talked about the complement cascade, and one effect of the complement cascade is complement proteins, once activated, can poke holes in the red blood cells in this cartoon, and then this is everything leaking out, and now you've got an osmotic crisis. Your red blood cells are destroyed, and the patient could die. So that's a type 2 hypersensitivity. This is the ABO system. These are the different blood types and transfusion reactions. This is donor you're getting a transfusion of blood from the donor to the recipient. It's a classic type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. And then the host cells, so the host is the recipient, are destroyed by this antibody immune response. So the antibodies binding to the antigens, complement proteins binding, and then ultimately complement proteins make this device that punctures holes into the cells of your red blood cells if you're the recipient or patient. And all these are all the complement proteins. So C5b, 6, 7, 8, and 9 make this membrane attack complex that punches a hole in the red blood cells. So if someone were accidentally given blood of the wrong type, so ideally, if you are, let's say this recipient is A positive, you'd want to give that recipient A positive blood, but you give it the recipient the wrong type of blood. This is a hemolytic transfusion reaction. So heme is red blood cells. Lytic is lysis, that means they bust open, and it was a transfusion, so the whole thing is called called a hemolytic transfusion reaction, but it is a type of type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. So it looks like to prevent transfusion reactions, blood is cross-matched. So like I say, if the recipient is A positive, the donor should also be A positive, ideally. Transfusion reactions are of two types. The recipient has pre-existing antibodies to the foreign blood groups That's kind of like what we saw in the cartoon. Or the recipient has no pre-existing antibodies to the foreign blood, and the blood functions normally for a while, but then the recipient mounts an immune response against the foreign blood. It happens gradually, and severe symptoms do not occur, but there are symptoms. All right, another classic case of a hypersensitivity type 2 reaction. So here's where we bring in the RH factor. So the RH factor is called the D antigen. So you know this. You may already know your blood type. If you're A negative, that means your red blood cells have the A antigen, but no RH antigen on them. There's no RH antigen. And the RH factor or antigen is sometimes called the D antigen. I don't know why they do that, but that's the way they do it. All right, so let's check out the first cartoon. So the mom here, so this cartoon always makes me laugh because in the first cartoon, oh look, she has bangs and she's so young and she has her head kind of, she's kind of got her chin up here. She looks okay. She's an RH negative mother. That means she does not have RH or D antigens on her red blood cells. But check it out. She has an RH positive fetus. So her fetus has RH antigens on its red blood cells. Now, what happens if some, and this doesn't happen every time, but sometimes the red blood cells from the RH positive fetus with the RH antigen on the red blood cells can cross the placenta and get into the mother's bloodstream. So now the mom, who's RH negative, has this foreign RH positive antigen on these red blood cells from the fetus. Now, it's not this, and then so then the mother over time will start making RH antibodies, and in this cartoon they're called anti-D antibodies. So it'll take time for the mom to build up all these antibodies, so it doesn't hurt the first fetus. It doesn't hurt the first fetus or embryo or baby. So number one is fine. But check it out. Between pregnancies, the mom had the red blood cells with the RH antigen on them. She mounted an immune response, and she built up all these anti-D or anti-RH antibodies in her bloodstream, and they could last for a while. So then she gets pregnant with her second child, who is also RH positive. Now, those anti-RH or anti-D antibodies may cross the placenta, and those antibodies will bind to the RH antigen on the RH positive fetus and destroy the red blood cells. And that's hemolytic disease of the newborn. 85% of the people, I think in this country, maybe around the world, have an antigen called RH. It's called for the rhesus monkey, where they found them, on their red blood cells. So they're called RH positive. They can also be called D positive, but they call them RH positive. And we talked about this. RH negative mother carries an RH positive child, may or may not contact blood from the RH positive child and then develop these antibodies to those RH antigens on the fetal red blood cells. This happens in anywhere from between 20 to 50% of pregnancies. So then if you ask what's the cause of hemolytic disease of the newborn, you would say it's when an RH negative mother is pregnant with her second child who is RH positive. If her second child is RH negative, that child will not get hemolytic disease of the newborn. But if her second child is RH positive and the anti-RH or IgD antibodies may cross the placenta, they may not cross the placenta. and then they would react with the fetal Rh antigen. This could destroy the fetal red blood cells. So my family did this experiment. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. My mother's Rh negative. We are all Rh positive. My mother never took any medication because I don't think it was available at the time. She never took any medication. And all my brothers and sisters were all Rh positive. Nothing happened to them. They didn't get hemolytic disease of the newborn. So even though I tell my brothers and sisters I tried to destroy them, it didn't work. But sometimes these antibodies can cross the placenta and they can destroy the red blood cells of the second fetus. Hemolytic disease of the newborn, it could have real limited symptoms, or it could cause really bad problems in the fetus. And then here's the pill that they give Rh negative mothers now, Rogam. So the mother's subsequent pregnancies are safe because Rogam stops her from making any antibodies, the anti-Rh or anti-IgD antibodies. So let's look at this question. Which of the following could result in hemolytic disease of the newborn? So on first pass, you should know, if you just look at this logically, any Rh negative mother could give her second child hemolytic disease of the newborn. So we have to further investigate 1. We don't need to worry about 2 or 3 because these are Rh positive mothers. Here's a Rh positive mother. We don't need to worry about that. Now this is tricky. This is like a logic trick question. It says either an Rh positive mother and an Rh negative factor, or an Rh negative mother and an Rh positive father. So we kind of have to look at this one, kind of think about this one. So let's look at the first one. Rh negative mother and an Rh negative father. Well, think about that. Well, maybe you don't have the background to think about that, but if they're both Rh negative, then none of their children can be Rh positive. So this Rh positive fetus here in the cartoon can't exist. So that one's gone. Now we have an Rh negative mother and an Rh positive father. Genetics wise, this first child or the second child or any of the children could possibly be Rh positive. So this one's looking pretty good. We already crossed this one out. This one says Rh negative mother and an Rh positive father. So now you could say it could be 4 or 5, but it can't be 5 because when you put an or in there, you're saying both could be true. So the answer is 4. I hope that explained how to answer a question like that. So more type 2 hypersensitivity reactions. Cytotoxic, again, this is cytotoxic, so it can destroy cells. So let's check it out. Here's a platelet. I hope you remember from 202 that helps form blood clots. Here's our drug or toxin of interest, this purple triangle. So it says in step 1, drug molecules bind to the platelet. So these drug molecules stick to the platelet. And now this drug platelet complex is antigenic. So that means these purple triangles look like antigens to your immune system. And you'll generate antibodies against them. So now the antibodies will bind to the drug of interest, which is now it looks like an antigen. So an antibody is binding an antigen as usual. And then as usual, complement will bind to this Fc region of the antibody. And then as usual, like we showed before, complement proteins C5 through C9 can make these, punch these holes, or MAC, membrane attack complexes, in the platelet, and the platelets lyse and the cytoplasm leaks out and the platelets are destroyed. And here again, here's our MAC, membrane attack complex, formed by complement proteins. Okay, so there's a a drug-induced type 2 reaction, thrombocytopenic purpura, where platelets are destroyed, and now you can't clot your blood. If you can't clot your blood, if you get a cut, you just freely bleed out. Okay, so those are all, so we just finished type 2. These are the antibodies used in the type 2 reactions are IgG or IgM mediated, and they're cytotoxic. Now let's start hypersensitivity type 3 reactions, which are IgG mediated, and these are immune complex reactions. So let's look at this. This is a blood vessel. So these guys, this is inside of a blood vessel. It's cut longitudinally. This is an endothelial cell lining the blood vessel. Here's another endothelial cell. Here's another endothelial cell lining the blood vessel. And then here's the lumen of the blood vessel. And you can see there's antibodies because you see the Y's. So, and then these little purple things are your antigen of interest. So antigens combine with antibodies as usual. So you can see this purple antigen is binding the antigen binding region of this antibody and also the antigen binding region of this antibody. So this purple antigen is hooking up, it's actually hooking up one, two, three antibodies. And the antibody in this case, in a type 3 reaction, the antibody of interest is IgG. So phagocytes are in your blood, so it'd be a monocyte because it's the blood. Remove most of the complexes. So these phagocytes, they'll have an Fc receptor in their plasma membrane. They'll bind to the Fc portion of the antibody, and phagocytes will try to destroy these antigen-antibody complexes in the blood. But some of these antigen-antibody complexes will bind to Fc receptors in the endothelial cells that line the blood vessel. And then guess what happens? Complement's also floating in your blood. Complement cascade happens. Complement proteins bind to the Fc portion of your antibody. Then we come over here, step 4. Now, but in this case, the antigen antibody complexes and the activated complements will activate neutrophils. So this is a neutrophil. The neutrophil will recognize this complex, this antigen antibody complex, and it will release inflammatory chemicals. So all these blue things, these are inflammatory chemicals. And then the inflammatory chemicals damage the underlying blood vessel wall. So these inflammatory chemicals will damage the endothelial cells, and it will damage the underlying blood vessel wall here, which is made of collagen, and then you get some smooth muscle cells out here. And then the inflammatory chemicals can get into the tissue underlying the blood vessels. So let's take a look at our green dot. Type 3 antigen antibody complexes may deposit or get trapped in certain tissues. So for some reason, these antigen antibody complexes tend to get trapped in blood vessels and tissues of the kidneys and your lungs. And then that can, at that point, after the neutrophils have been activated and release these inflammatory chemicals, that could also trigger mast cell degranulation of more inflammatory chemicals, and then you get an inflammatory reaction in your kidney or your lung. So that's an example of a type 3 reaction. What follows, you could get this disease, glomerulonephritis. So I don't know if you remember from 202, so this would be a frontal section of the kidney, okay, and then the nephron here is a functional unit of the kidney, and here's all these glomerular capillaries inside the Bowman's capsule. And then when those when this happens, when a type 3 reaction happens in these glomerular capillaries that destroys the capillaries, now you can't filter your blood and you lose kidney function and then have to go on dialysis or you don't survive. Hypersensitivity type 3 also manifests itself in rheumatoid arthritis. So IgM and IgG, they bind to form a complex, and then those complexes deposit in your joints. Inflammatory chemicals are released and your tissues, your joint tissue is damaged. Tissues can swell, you have joint pain. This looks really, really painful. And then this is the pathogenesis of rheumatoid arthritis. Again, you don't have to know the details, but rheumatoid arthritis, look at the players. Antigen presenting cells, T cells, B cells, macrophages, TNF alpha, IL-1, all these things that we've heard about result in articular cartilage damage and rheumatoid arthritis. Lupus, you may have heard of this, systemic lupus erythematosus. It's a type 3 hypersensitivity. It's complex mediated, so that means it's an antigen-antibody complex mediated disease. In lupus, you make autoantibodies, so it's an autoimmune disease, and they can deposit these autoantibodies, bind to these antigens, and they deposit in blood vessels. So here's a cartoon of an artery that's cut, and you come down here and enlarge that. You see this complex mediated, so all these antigens and antibodies stuck in the wall of these blood vessels. So for example, here's an antibody. The Fc portion is stuck in the wall of the blood vessel, and then you have the ensuing systemic lupus erythematosus. The trigger for this is unknown at this point in time. And you can also get this characteristic facial rash with lupus. There's hypersensitivity pneumonitis, can affect the lungs. So allergens inhaled deeply. So here's a cartoon, here's some allergens. You take them deep down into your lung. The allergens cause antibody production down there. So farmer's lung, if you're exposed to moldy hay, you can get pigeon breeder's lung, you can get mushroom grower's lung, librarian's lung, in the old moldy books that no one looks at. So you get basically neutrophils releasing inflammatory chemicals. So here's a neutrophil, here's the granules in there, releases inflammatory chemicals, and you get these hypersensitivity reactions. Oh, there's the old books. Oh, there's the moldy hay.